Welcome to Curiously Kaitlyn, where we take kid questions about the Bible, theology, or God, and find scholars who can answer them in words regular people can understand. This week, we are continuing our series on Lent and Easter, the seasons in the church calendar where we reflect on our sin, practice repentance, and celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and look forward to our resurrection. Today, we're talking about Good Friday, the day in the church calendar when we remember the crucifixion and death of Jesus Christ. For those of us who grew up in the church and have attended many Good Friday services, we might miss how strange it is that we call this day good. We've spent many episodes now in this series emphasizing that the death of Jesus was especially cruel, dehumanizing, shameful, torturous. But then the one day on the church calendar that we spend specifically focusing on it, dwelling on it, facing it fearlessly, we call that day good. But why? Why wouldn't we call it regrettably necessary, unfortunately important, required, essential, demanded, but horrible? This is an important question for us to answer, not only to figure out why we call this day one thing over another, but because the fact that Christians call this singular historical event the day men killed God on a cross, the fact that we call that day good is central to the Christian faith.
I don't know. That doesn't make any sense.
Curiously Kaitlyn.
Dr. Joshua Jipp, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
This is Dr. Joshua Jipp. He is professor of New Testament and director of the Henry Center for Theological Understanding at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and the author of many books, including Pauline Theology as a Way of Life. Let's hear our kid question.
Why is Good Friday called good?
Dr. Jipp, what is your just initial reaction to this question? Why is Good Friday called good?
Well, it's called good because at the heart of the Christian faith is the death of Jesus on the cross, and we celebrate that on Good Friday.
Yeah. Okay. So before we get into, I want to at some point come back to, we have a special day for this that we have called Good Friday. But let's start with the first thing you said, which is this is good news to us. We've been doing a whole series on Lent and Easter. So we've talked a lot about the crucifixion. We've talked a lot about suffering and death and Jesus's ministry. But it still seems like I think it takes us a lot of episodes to get our head around the fact that we're calling something horrific. We've had 2 episodes now where we've talked a lot about the kind of details of the crucifixion as this like really horrible, degrading, violent thing. Why is it good news to us?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's supposed to be shocking. It's not supposed to be the kind of thing that a human would just sort of invent as, here is great news, as you're saying. This shameful, painful, embarrassing, sort of thing that ends in our Savior's death. So it's important, I think, that we embrace the fact that Good Friday is it's supposed to be shocking. It's supposed to be horrific. And in some ways, at the heart of our Christian faith is a paradox. Who God is most fully revealed in the death of Jesus. And so there's a lot of places in the Bible that set this forth in really powerful ways. One of my favorite ones is actually in the book of Revelation. And so, and some of you may remember in the book of Revelation, John is in heaven and he's weeping. And he's saying there's no one here that's able to open up this scroll. And basically all of world history is going to be a disaster. God's not going to truly rule over this world. The bad guys are going to win. The good guys are going to lose. And he's weeping, and an angel tells him, don't be afraid, John. And basically, he hears then, what he hears is the Lion from the tribe of Judah has conquered. And so, in your mind, you should be thinking powerful, warrior, victorious. incredible conqueror,
Yeah.
and he is going to kill his enemies. He's going to wipe them from the face of the earth. So that's what he hears. But then what he sees is the slain lamb. And, I don't know how it's I say it's a paradox because somehow we're supposed to imagine both of those things, this powerful lion from the victorious tribe of Judah and a slain lamb that's seated on the throne with God, and he's going to rule the world and open up the scroll so that the good guys win, so that world history basically unfolds according to God's purposes. So I hope that makes sense. There's some of this paradox that the New Testament is always putting together. Is Friday good? Well, it's the death, horrific death of Jesus. And yet as Christians, it's absolutely central to our understanding of who God is.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about, we're spending this whole season of Lent thinking about sin, thinking about death. And then we spend this really important day in the church calendar thinking about the crucifixion before we get to the resurrection on Easter Sunday. Talk to us a little bit about in the Gospels how this plays out, because I think some of us, maybe we grew up in traditions where there was a lot of talk about the crucifixion and not a lot of talk about Jesus's ministry. And then maybe sometimes I have found there's some people that can kind of overcorrect and go, we don't really need to focus on the crucifixion. Let's just focus on the ministry and the teaching. Talk to us a little bit about how, especially the Gospels, before we get to the epistles and Revelation and describing kind of theological commentary on what happens, how do the Gospels talk about what's happening in the crucifixion?
Yeah. So, I love it. I love it that we have 4 Gospels. We could answer that question, of 4 similar but different ways.
We've talked about this before, but just as a reminder, the 4 Gospels at the start of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all tell true stories about who Jesus is, his ministry on earth, and his death and resurrection. But they each tell that story differently, focusing on different parts, arranging the story in a different order, explaining different things for different audiences. The gospel writers had different people in mind when they wrote their gospels. Were they writing to Jewish people who knew God but needed to be introduced to Jesus? Or Gentiles who had no background with the Jewish faith? They also had different goals in mind when they wrote. Were they trying to show that Jesus was a Jewish king in the line of David? That he was the creator of the universe, savior of all creation? Were they trying to emphasize his authority or his compassion? These are all true things. But the gospel writers had different parts of who Jesus is and his mission on earth that they were trying to emphasize.
Let me go to the Gospel of Mark. You may remember that the Gospel of Mark has these 16 chapters, and the first 8 you have kind of as you're saying, Kaitlyn, Jesus is this powerful teacher. He doesn't have scribal education, but he can teach better than anyone else. The demons are, there, and he's casting them out, and they're terrified of him. He's healing people. People are wanting to follow him because they're sort of like, the power of God is empirically available to us in this person. But then you get the turning point right in the middle of the Gospel of Mark where, Jesus is with his disciples at Caesarea Philippi, and he asks his disciple Peter, who do people say that I am? Peter gives some answers. Jesus says, but who do you say that I am, Peter? And Peter says what we would think would be the right answer. You're the Christ. We would all say, of course. We call him Christ. He's the Messiah. But then what happens is Jesus tells him to keep his mouth shut. Don't tell anybody, which is really strange. Why isn't that the right confession? Why would he tell Peter to basically be silenced? And then he goes on to give some teaching saying, this is what Jesus does. This is what must happen. The Son of Man, is going to suffer. The Son of Man is going to be rejected by the leaders. He's going to be crucified. And Peter takes him aside and rebukes rebukes Jesus to his face. And Jesus says to Peter, some of the most shocking words in the New Testament, Get behind me, Satan, which is sort of like, you can, I often teach this in a way that's saying, you can have the right confession. You are the Christ. but act somehow be thinking the thoughts of Satan, not the thoughts of
Ooh.
God. Why? Because you are making the Messiah in your own image. Is he powerful? Yes, but I want this powerful, victorious, the people I hate, he hates too, right? The people he loves, he
Yeah.
loves. It's sort of you make him in your own image.
Yeah.
And if that's what you want the Messiah to be, Jesus is saying, you fall back in line. You're the disciple. I'll tell you what the Messiah does. And then, the next 8 chapters of the Gospel of Mark, we see Jesus making his way to Jerusalem, trying to prepare his disciples that he is going to suffer, die, and be resurrected. And it's a challenging teaching for them that they're not fully able to comprehend. They don't get it, until after his death and resurrection, that somehow, disciples of Jesus have to, be able to put power and weakness together. They have to be able to put resurrection and cross together. All of these things that seem as if they would be at odds with one another, their minds are going to have to be changed and transformed. So if they're going to really be disciples of Jesus.
And now a word from our sponsor. Wait, what's a sponsor?
Did you know that an estimated 5 billion plastic hand soap and cleaning bottles are thrown away each year? And if that's not bad enough, most cleaning formulas are 90% water, which is heavy to ship, leading to excessive carbon emissions. We've talked a lot about creation on Curiously, Kaitlyn, and how we need to care well for creation. Well, Blueland is one way we can do that. Blueland is on a mission to eliminate single-use plastic by reinventing cleaning essentials to be better for you and the planet with the same powerful clean you're used to. The idea is simple. Fill your reusable bottles with water, drop in the tablets, and wait for them to dissolve. And when you're out, get refills starting at just $2.25. I use Blueland products to clean my home, and I love knowing that every refill is one less plastic container filling up landfills. Plus, it's pretty fun to add the refills to water and watch the tablets become a whole bottle of cleaner. And I'm guessing lots of kids would love watching it too. Blueland has a special offer for our listeners. Right now, get 15% off your first order by going to blueland.com/curiously. You won't want to miss this. blueland.com/curiously for 15% off. That's blueland.com/curiously to get 15% off. Yeah, it reminds me too of how it's interesting, you grow up in the church, especially if you grow up in a more liturgical church that really celebrates multiple days of services during Holy Week and really has, if you went to Good Friday services, which even a lot of, lower churches have a Good Friday service. But if you've grown up in the church and you're just kind of familiar with that, we talked about this in an episode a few weeks ago about crosses, just seem sort of familiar and common to us. We lose a lot of the sense of this is an instrument of torture and death and execution. But also with Good Friday, sometimes I think we almost forget that it is actually really significant that we still spend so much time remembering the crucifixion. In retrospect, it would make sense if Christians had just gone like, yeah, whatever. That happened and the mechanics of that were sort of necessary. But let's move past, let's just celebrate the resurrection. Why? And a lot of people who, don't go to a Good Friday service, I know that at least at my church, at every church I've ever been in, the Easter Sunday services are way bigger than the Good Friday services. So there is still that temptation. But talk to us a little bit about why we even have this service and why we spend time remembering this, because it would make some logical sense for us to go, sure, there's a lot of attention to it, as you've just described in the Gospels. The New Testament talks about this a lot. But that's the sad, awful, yes, it's good, but isn't it just sort of good because of what it produces? And so maybe we just focus on the resurrection and we kind of ignore the crucifixion part.
Well, that's a great question. And I mean, both in terms of, how, just in terms of you say, wouldn't it be logical that we would do this? I think, there are some reasons why many churches still try to press into Good Friday and not just skip to Easter. Some of it, I think, is because Jesus really just taught us the importance of remembering this. So, at the Last Supper that Jesus shares with his disciples, do this in remembrance of me. I mean, he institutes, and we see that in this Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we see Paul, in 1 Corinthians, remembering Jesus saying to his people, pause, eat this it's celebrated on the Passover, eat this meal, the food, the drink, specifically to remember who I am and what what I've done for you. So it reminds me that just the cross is central to how God saves, central to who God is. And I think, for me, there is also, I don't know, I experience, instances of grief and loneliness and, disappointment and pain and adversity. And, the cross is a reminder to me and to all of us that, life is not, in the meantime, right now, is not just all resurrection. I mean, there is that. But there is a sense in which Jesus, not a sense, Jesus did fully identify, with our human flesh, took on our sins, our fears, our grief, albeit, without sin. And so, as the book of Hebrews says, he's qualified to be our great high priest in heaven because, he knows what it's like to, go through the whole experience of humanity. So, I think there's a lot of reasons why it's good for us to not just think about it as, it had to happen, so we get to Sunday. There can be that popular kind of phrase that's like, what is it? Friday's here, but Sunday's coming. And I'm not against that. I mean, it's sort of, even as we experience pain and suffering and all of these things, we do so with hope. Yeah. And so I'm not against that, but at the same time, it's a good practice to sort of like still sit in the in the darkness of Good Friday. If I can just add this.
Yeah, please.
Mark, Mark is the Gospel of Mark is fascinating because he doesn't resolve the darkness and the pain as much as the other Gospels in some ways do. I mean, Jesus dies on the cross in the Gospel of Mark, saying, my God, where are you? Why have you forsaken me?
Yeah.
And we don't get, we hear about the empty tomb, but and the women have experienced something, but we don't get these resurrection appearances in Mark.
Here, Dr. Jipp is giving us another example of how the Gospels differ, even though they are all telling the same story. Mark's account of Jesus' life and death and resurrection emphasizes the uncertainty of the whole thing while it was actually happening. The fear the disciples felt, the horror of the death, the confusion afterwards. If you go to Mark right now and read the ending, you'll see what we mean. It ends abruptly, which is why some later editors probably adjusted the ending to make for a cleaner, happier one. But it ends with fear and uncertainty. That's not the end of the whole story, but Mark wants us to enter into that reality, which is what we're doing during Lent, remembering that for a while, we didn't know how the story would end.
In other words, Mark is, I think, in some ways trying to really hit, Christians in terms of saying, don't move, the resurrection's important, but don't move there too quickly. Now, Luke has Jesus saying from the cross, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. So there's different ways of thinking about this, even within the New Testament, but
Yeah, I have come to really love Mark, but for many reasons, but one of them being this sense of like, you do finish it, the shorter Mark, you finish it and you're just like, wait, what? What is happening? The women are afraid and like, you're not totally clear on what's happened. And I appreciate trying to kind of like enter into that sense of, Dorothy Sayers has this amazing essay where she's talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And she says at one point, like, maybe he is safely dead and buried. But the only time you could say that with complete confidence was on the eve of the resurrection. After that, whether you're scared or you're excited, there is this sense of like, something could have happened. I don't know. Maybe he did. And if he did, everything is different.
Totally.
Talk to us a little bit about being at a Good Friday service. There will be people who hear this a few days before they go to a Good Friday service. I last year taught little children on Good Friday for the first time, and it was a daunting task to go. We're very committed at my church we're going to tell the story of the crucifixion. The kids know Jesus rose again. I mean, they've heard that story many times. So like you just said, we actually can kind of, I think, face the difficulty of this more wholeheartedly because we know that's not the end of the story. But we were really persistent to say, like, we're going to leave the service in darkness. We're not going to just kind of go, oh, and then don't worry, in a couple of days, everything will be fine. But speak a little bit to the people who are like, okay, I'm going to go to a Good Friday service. How should I be thinking about the fact that we're going to spend a day just kind of sitting in that difficulty? Are there things I should be thinking about? Are there ways, maybe even, parents with kids are wondering, like, this is pretty dark. Like, how should we be thinking about the fact that we're going to spend a whole day and we're not in a lot of our churches? Maybe some of us will do, don't worry, Sunday's coming. But a lot of us are going to try and stay away from that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, that's a great question. I have 3 kids and a foster baby right now, and we'll be, going to a Good Friday service. And, I'm thinking about even preparing, them for this. I want them, they're going to grow, they're growing up, and they're going to go out in the world, and they're going to navigate, a world that's, that's got a lot of joy and beauty and a lot of pain and darkness. And so, the easy answer in some ways might be to say, sit with your own sin. And yes, do that. I'm not against that. Yeah. But maybe maybe it's a good idea to think about, where do you see the world to be at its most broken? Where is it? Where do you really see suffering? Where are there places where there is, instances of, we could see Jesus being in solidarity, with, I don't know how political to get, but people that are, afraid of being deported, or people that are experiencing, warfare and violence. And, not to give a trite answer to that, but Jesus sees it. He's in solidarity with it. How do we enter into sort of that pain and brokenness, so that we can really long for, resurrection, and not just our own individual, resurrection, but, praying for, anticipating, longing for, new creation, new heavens, new earth. You could at that Good Friday service enter in and say, kind of like Jesus did, where are you, God, in this midst?
Yes.
Even the act of saying, where are you, God, of course, is an act of hope. It's an act of faith and belief, so identifying that, so I don't know, that might be something, to consider as we all enter into Good Friday. I don't want to also run over too quickly, make it sound trite, as if I don't think Good Friday is also a time for us individually to be a little introspective as well.
Sure.
To enter into sort of confession and a time of, gratitude for the way that God has saved us individually. I think that's maybe a bit more obvious, but also important aspect of Good Friday.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate that. I've been at lots of churches where part of the service is us sort of identifying with the crowd to say, there is a sense in which, I'm thinking about my own sin and that Jesus died for me. And so I wave the palm branches on Palm Sunday, and then I play the part of the crowd on Friday and say, crucify him. Yeah. But I so appreciate you saying, there's that more obvious way to think about it. And then there's also, I think a lot of us are going to go to services on Good Friday and be really deeply affected by how much brokenness we are seeing in the world right now, politically, around the world, in our country, in our neighborhood even, and recognizing that there's also this opportunity to say, this is how seriously God takes this. He's not ignoring it. He identifies with it, like you said. And this is not the end of the story. We are going to get to a day where we remember not just that Jesus resurrected, but what that means for all of creation.
That's right. Yeah.
Dr. Jipp, our last question always is, imagine you are with a small child, and maybe there is a grown-up at church that's like, hey, this is the guy to ask about Good Friday. A parent's going I don't know how to answer this question. Imagine a small child asks you, why is Good Friday called good? What would your kind of kid answer to them be?
I haven't talked about this, but it maybe is one of the most important parts of, the answer. I might say something like, Good Friday is good because we, on this day, we celebrate the sure knowledge that God is love, actually. So who is God? Most fundamentally, the Bible speaks of either the Father sending the Son to us out of his love for us. Or, Jesus says, when I am lifted up, raised up on the cross, I will draw all people to myself. It's, that's the way that they'll know that I'm loved. So I think if I was just going to give, like a really short and hopefully clear answer, I would really want to emphasize on Good Friday, we know who God is, and we know him to be a God that's fundamentally loving.
That is so good. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Jipp, for just taking this question really seriously with me.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
You might have noticed something in this episode. We have repeated ourselves a lot in this Lent and Easter series. We keep coming back over and over again, not only just to sin and death, but to the horror and also goodness of Christ's crucifixion. Why do we have to keep saying over and over again how horrible this was, how serious it all is, how strange but important this central part of the Christian message is? One reason is that this is the part of the message that over history has been the hardest part for people to swallow. Today, we tend to think certain elements of Christian ethics are the real challenge for new believers, and that can be true. The Christian faith confronts and challenges people across the political and ideological spectrum, asking things of us that we sometimes don't want to give, even though what we receive is far greater. But humans have often gotten tripped up on the crucifixion. We've either insisted God couldn't really suffer. Jesus only appeared to suffer. Some early Christians even claimed that. The idea that our hero, our leader, our God would die a humiliating and painful death was too much to believe. Other Christians in history insisted that the crucifixion was real and painful, but it happened to a kind and gentle teacher, not to the God who made the universe. The crucifixion is evidence of what empire does to any threat to its rule, those Christians much later in history would say. Many non-Christians have borrowed things from the Christian faith. Maybe Jesus' teachings about the poor and the sick, or the prophets' words about injustice and evil, or stories from the Old Testament about kings and battles and nations. Many non-Christians have even borrowed the story of the resurrection, turning this singular, world-changing miracle into a parable about new life, becoming a better person, the hope that things can always get better. But no one is borrowing the crucifixion. No one hears that story and thinks it makes a nice parable or helps them live a better life or makes for a nice inspirational message. The crucifixion is an affront to all of our ideas about how life should work, about what God would do, about how good stories get told. It is an alarming, surprising, shocking truth that the God who made the world came into the world and willingly gave himself up to the worst that humans do to each other. For our sake. We've been repeating ourselves this whole series because we need help really getting it. We need help really seeing it. We need help believing it. But it is true. As Dr. Jipp said, God is love. And when the world God made is broken so deeply, when the creatures he loves are so wayward, he did something nearly unbelievable to fix it. And we need these weeks of Lent helping us understand it so that we can praise him more fully for it. Curiously Kaitlyn is a production of Holy Post Media. Produced by Mike Stralo. Editing by Seth Gorvet. Theme song by Phil Vischer. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a review so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus cute kids, and never any butt news.